400 Hells Angels filling every parking spot on Fairview Street outside a two-story extended stay motel was not something Belhaven, Ohio had ever seen before. Especially not for a 74-year-old homeless man nobody in that town could have named if you'd asked them that morning. He had no family listed anywhere in the county, no next of kin on any hospital form, nothing that marked him as anything more than another face the town had quietly stopped seeing. But it all started 6 hours earlier, when a librarian named Maggie Ellison opened a returned paperback and found a folded note tucked into the last page, written in a shaking hand that had clearly taken a long time to get every word right. The Belhaven Public Library sat 2 blocks off Main Street in a building that had once been a bank. Tall windows and a marble floor that still echoed a little too much for a place meant to be quiet. A brass plaque by the door still read Farmers Trust and Savings, 1911, though nobody under 60 in Belhaven remembered it as anything but the library. Maggie Ellison had worked the front desk there for 9 years, long enough to know most of her regulars by the books they returned rather than their names, and long enough to notice when one of them stopped coming in. She kept a small ledger of her own, separate from the library system, tracking which regulars hadn't shown up in a while, a habit she'd started after an elderly patron had died alone in his apartment 3 winters back, and nobody had thought to check on him until his rent came due. The old man in the gray coat had been checking out the same paperback, a battered copy of a novel about a man crossing the country on foot, every 2 weeks for the better part of a year, always returning it exactly on time, always sitting in the same chair by the window that caught the afternoon light. He never asked for help finding anything else, never lingered at the desk to talk the way some of the other regulars did, and Maggie had learned early on to let him have his hour of quiet without intruding on it. He hadn't come in for 3 weeks. When another patron finally returned his overdue copy that Tuesday afternoon, Maggie opened the back cover out of habit, checking for damage before she reshelved it, and found the folded page tucked against the spine. The note was addressed to no one in particular, and to a very specific handful of people all at once. To whoever finds this, it began. My name is Harold Rankin, though for 22 years the only name that mattered was Deuce. I rode with the Ridgeline chapter of the Hells Angels from 1974 until I lost my nerve for it in 1996. The same year I lost my wife Peggy, and most of what was left of myself along with her. If any of my old brothers are still riding, especially a prospect I brought up myself named Nate, tell him Deuce is still alive, and that he's sorry, and that he understands if it's too late for anybody to care. I'm not asking to be found. I just didn't want to leave this world without somebody knowing I was still in it a little while longer. The handwriting grew noticeably less steady in the final 2 lines, as though the effort of finishing it had cost him something physical to produce. Before we get to what Maggie Ellison did with that note, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to that library desk, where a woman who had never ridden a motorcycle in her life sat holding a stranger's confession, with no idea yet what it would set in motion, because in the next 6 hours, 400 of them were about to answer it. Harold Rankin had been Deuce to the Ridgeline chapter for 22 years, the kind of member other riders brought their questions to before they brought them to the club president. Patient in a way that made him a natural teacher of 19-year-old prospects who thought they already knew everything. He'd earned the road name after walking away from 2 separate wrecks in his first 3 years riding, both times climbing back on a bike within the week, and the name had stuck long after the bruises faded. He'd met Peggy at a diner outside Danforth in 1971, waitressing her way through night school, and she had ridden pillion on every run he made for the next 25 years. right up until the ovarian cancer took 18 months to finish what it started. She used to keep the chapter's books in a shoebox under their bed, better at tracking dues than the treasurer ever was, and half the old Ridgeline members still remembered her recipe for the chili she brought to every summer run. Harold had held together through the funeral and fallen apart in the 11 months that followed, drinking through most of them, missing meetings, missing runs, until the shame of what he'd become around brothers who still respected the man he used to be became heavier than simply disappearing. He left the chapter quietly in 1996, told no one where he was going, packed what fit on the bike, and had not spoken to another Hell's Angel in 28 years since. He sold the bike itself 2 years into his wandering, in a pawn shop parking lot in a town he could no longer name, and had walked or bussed everywhere since. He had drifted for most of those years, working odd jobs in towns he never stayed in long, roofing crews and dish rooms, and one long stretch on a highway maintenance contract that ended when his hands started shaking too badly to hold a shovel steady, and had landed in Belhaven 3 years ago at the Sundown Extended Stay on Fairview Street, a room paid week to week from disability and whatever cash work he could still manage. 6 months ago, a doctor at the county clinic had told him the pain in his stomach was late-stage pancreatic cancer, and had given him, at the outside, another few months. Harold had told no one, the same way he'd told no one about the drinking 28 years before, and had simply kept returning that same paperback to the library every 2 weeks, sitting in the same chair, because it was the one part of his week that still felt like his own. Milt Hooper, who owned the Sundown Extended Stay, had posted a notice on Harold's door that same Tuesday morning. Pay the 3 weeks he owed by 6 that evening, or his belongings would be set out on the curb and the room relet by morning. Milt ran 11 units and had made a business philosophy out of never carrying anyone's debt past a week, telling anyone who complained that sentiment didn't cover a mortgage payment. He didn't know about the cancer, hadn't asked, and had made it plain more than once that a man who couldn't keep up with rent wasn't his problem to solve. He'd evicted 3 other tenants that same year under the identical notice, taped to the door in the same block letters, and had never once lost sleep over any of them. Harold had nowhere left to go by that evening, and no one left to call, only a pencil, a library book, and a folded page. Maggie sat with a note for the better part of an hour before she did anything with it, unsure whether it was a message meant to be acted on or simply a private goodbye she had no right to interrupt. She read it 3 times over, and each time the line about not wanting to be found without someone knowing sat heavier in her chest than the time before. She thought about the man 3 winters back who died alone with nobody checking on him. And she thought about the empty chair by the window that hadn't held anyone in 3 weeks. In the end, that decided it for her. She searched the chapter name online and found the Ridgeline chapter's public contact page still active under new leadership. A simple site advertising toy runs and veterans fundraisers. And she called the number listed, expecting, she admitted later, that nothing would come of it at all, that she'd get a voicemail or a stranger who'd never heard the name Deuce in his life. The man who answered that call was Nate Osai, who had been the 19-year-old prospect the note mentioned by name and was now, at 51, the president of the Ridgeline chapter himself. He had wondered about Deuce for 28 years, had tried twice in the early 2000s to track him down through old addresses and mutual acquaintances, and come up empty both times, and had eventually made a kind of peace with never knowing what happened to the man who taught him almost everything he knew about riding, and rather more about how to treat people while doing it. When Maggie read him the note over the phone, Nate went quiet on the other end of the line long enough that she asked if he was still there. "Read me the part about the diner again," he said. Maggie did. Nate's voice, when he spoke again, had gone thick. "That's him," he said. Nobody else on this earth would put it exactly that way. He used to say the same thing about that diner every time somebody asked how he met Peggy, word for 20 years. He made one phone call after he hung up with Maggie to the Ridgeline Chapter's road captain. And then he made a second call, and within 40 minutes the calls had stopped being something Nate was making himself and had become something moving on its own. Chapter presidents calling chapter presidents across 3 states. The way word moves through a network built for exactly this kind of thing. A woman named Delia Fox, who ran the phone tree for the State Confederation of Chapters, later said she'd never seen a call chain move that fast for anything short of a member's funeral, and that by the time the message reached her own phone, it had already passed through 11 other hands, each one adding nothing but the same 2 facts. Deuce is alive, and he needs us tonight. She made 40 calls herself in under half an hour, her voice giving out by the last dozen, and kept making them anyway. Nobody had to be convinced twice. A prospect who'd been mentored by half the men now making calls was homeless, dying, and 6 miles from being put out on a curb with nothing. For the next 3 hours, Fairview Street had no idea what was heading its way. Highways in 3 directions filled with riders answering the same 2-line message forwarded phone to phone. Deuce is alive. He needs us in Belhaven tonight. Nobody asked for details before they left their driveways. Nobody needed more than the name and the town. Milt Hooper set Harold's 2 suitcases on the sidewalk at 6 o'clock exactly, the way he'd promised, and told him he had until morning to find somewhere else to be. Harold sat down on the curb beside his own belongings because his legs had stopped being reliable an hour earlier. The cancer and the cold and the shame of the whole afternoon working on him all at once, and put his head in his hands. He had already decided, sitting there, that he would spend that night walking toward the county shelter 6 blocks over, and worry about tomorrow once he got there. The same plan he'd made a dozen times in a dozen other towns. He did not see the first 3 motorcycles turn onto Fairview Street 4 minutes later, and would later say he thought, at first, that the sound was simply his own hearing starting to go along with everything else. Engines. That was the sound Milt Hooper heard first, a low building rumble that didn't stop building the way a normal handful of bikes would have. By the time he came back out to see what the noise was, Fairview Street had filled with riders as far as he could see in both directions, engines cutting to silence in waves, leather and patches from chapters whose names he didn't recognize, standing shoulder to shoulder on a street that had never held more than a dozen parked cars at once. Riders had come from Danforth, from 2 counties over, from a Chapter 3 states away whose president had once, as a teenager, spent a summer being taught to ride by a patient man everyone called Deuce. News trucks arrived not long after the bikes did, having picked up the story from a scanner call about traffic congestion on Fairview Street that turned out to be considerably more than traffic congestion. Nate Osai came through the crowd first, on foot, and knelt on the sidewalk in front of the old man sitting beside 2 packed suitcases. "Deuce," Nate said. Harold looked up, confused, certain for a moment that the cancer had finally started taking his mind along with everything else. "It's Nate," he said. "You taught me how to counter-steer in a gravel lot behind the old clubhouse in 1995. You told me a man who panics in a turn has already lost it before he even leans." Harold's hands, already shaking from the disease, started shaking harder from something else entirely. "You remember that," he whispered. "Every word of it," Nate said. "We never stopped looking. We just ran out of roads to look down. Among the 400 was a woman named Carla Whitcomb, 58, who had ridden 3 hours from a chapter in the next state over the moment her own president called her personally rather than sending a group text. An honor she understood immediately meant something serious. She had never met Harold Rankin in her life, but her late father had told her, more than once, about a rider named Deuce who'd once talked him through changing a blown tire on the shoulder of a highway in a thunderstorm, rather than riding on past a stranger in trouble, and she had grown up believing that story the way other kids grew up on fairy tales. She stood near the back of the crowd on Fairview Street with tears she didn't bother wiping away, grateful simply to be present for the end of a story her father had told her the beginning of decades, before either of them had ever heard the name Belhaven. Milt Hooper opened his mouth to say something about the room and the rent, and thought better of it the moment 400 sets of eyes turned toward him at once. Nobody threatened him. Nobody had to. He said nothing further, and nobody asked him to. By the next morning, the local news segment that had started as a traffic oddity had turned into the lead story on 3 regional stations, and the library itself saw more visitors in the following week than it usually saw in a month, several of them asking specifically to sit in the chair by the window, as though proximity to it might explain how an old man's quiet Tuesday habit had turned into 400 motorcycles on a residential street. Maggie found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, giving the same answer to every reporter who asked why she'd bothered chasing down a stranger's note instead of simply reshelving the book. That a library was supposed to be a place where nobody disappeared without somebody noticing, and that she'd only done the last part of her job a little later than she should have. Harold Rankin did not spend that night on a curb. Nate Osai paid off every dollar owed to Milt Hooper on the spot, more out of principle than necessity, and then arranged for Harold to be moved that same evening into a hospice facility 2 towns over where the staff specialized in exactly the kind of care his last months would need. The Ridgeline chapter, along with writers from as far away as 3 states over, covered every cost his own disability couldn't, and made a standing arrangement that Harold would not spend another day without a visitor unless he specifically asked for one. A sign-up sheet started circulating among the 400 riders still standing on Fairview Street before the ambulance had even finished loading him in. Chapter members claiming days of the week the way people claim shifts at a hospital bedside, and within an hour every day of the month had a name attached to it. Nate came every Sunday himself, and brought, on the second visit, a patch that had sat folded in a drawer for 28 years, waiting for a chance that nobody had believed would come. It was the same design the Ridgeline chapter had worn in 1996, retired years ago when the artwork changed, kept by Nate for reasons he could never fully explain to himself until that Sunday. He sat at Harold's bedside and told him the chapter had voted, unanimously and without a single member dissenting, to reinstate him as a lifetime member in good standing, the 28 years of silence forgiven the moment the vote was called. Harold, too weak by then to sit up on his own, asked Nate to pin it to the blanket instead of a jacket he no longer had the strength to wear, and Nate did, his hands considerably less steady than they'd been at 19, learning to countersteer in a gravel lot. Maggie Ellison visited too, twice in that first month, bringing the same paperback each time, so Harold would have something familiar to hold even when he was too tired to read, along with the crossword page torn from that day's newspaper, since he'd once mentioned, in passing, that he used to do one with his coffee every morning before the disability check stopped covering a subscription. He told her, the second time, that he'd chosen that particular library chair for a year because it was the only spot in town where nobody ever asked him a single question he didn't want to answer. He said he was glad, in the end, that she'd asked him one anyway, even if she'd done it by reading a note instead of speaking to his face. She told him she'd started a new page in her own ledger, just for him, one that read visited rather than hasn't come in, and that she intended to keep it filled for as long as there were Sundays left to fill it. Milt Hooper, for his part, quietly changed his eviction policy the following month, giving tenants a full 30 days' notice, instead of a single afternoon, though he never once said out loud whose curb had made him reconsider it. Nate visits every Sunday still, and is taken to bringing his own son along the last few visits, a boy of 9 who has started asking, with the particular persistence of 9-year-olds, to be taught how to countersteer himself someday. Nate tells him there's a man down the hall who could probably explain it better than anyone else alive, and the boy is taken to sitting at Harold's bedside, asking questions. Harold answers slower than he used to, but answers all the same. Patient in exactly the way 22 years of teaching prospects had once made him. Harold Rankin hid one message in a library book, hoping somebody, somewhere, might still remember his name. 400 riders came to prove they never had. If you believe nobody should have to disappear quietly, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.